Hi, I'm Erica Chenoweth. I'm the co-director along with Marie Berry of the Inclusive Global Leadership Initiative here at the University of Denver. I'm delighted to be sitting with Mary Elizabeth King, a friend and colleague of mine who is one of the world's foremost experts on the topic of civil resistance, both due to her own lifetime commitment to the practice of civil resistance and to another lifetime of commitment to scholarship and historical inquiry into the topic of civil resistance. And Mary is also known for her work, both as an individual advocate of women's participation in nonviolent struggle, but also in understanding the important role of gender in the context of peace building. And because IGLE is so focused on elevating the work of women identified activists at the grassroots who are focusing on trying to create more just and sustainably peaceful settings, we thought we couldn't pass up the opportunity to ask Mary a few questions about her own experience as an activist in the civil rights movement and one of the promoters of an important pamphlet that she wrote with Casey Hayden, is that right? Called Sex and Caste, a kind of memo, alongside a lot of her own research on women and mobilization. So first, Mary, welcome, and thanks for taking a few minutes to talk to our IGLE friends about this topic.
Delighted to be with you.
Great. So I wanted to ask you first if you could talk a little bit about the background for the memo that you wrote with Casey Hayden called Sex and Caste.
Well, you know, first of all, I was just a little munchkin in the civil rights movement. I made my way to Atlanta at age 22 and fortunately was able to work with Ella Baker and Professor Howard Zinn for a year before I went on to the staff of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Ella Baker is one of the great voices in U.S. social history, and she has not been sufficiently recognized even now. But she brought to the table of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which she herself shepherded into being because it was Miss Baker who convened the leaders of all the Southern sit-in campaigns on April 1st, 1960 at her alma mater, Shaw University in North Carolina. But Miss Baker's view was that leadership exists everywhere. And the job of the organizer is not to seek glamour or leadership, but to seek potential and promise in the people with whom the organizer's working. And she saw women as a greatly under-resourced capacity for bringing about justice. So she had enormous influence on Robert Moses, who was the Mississippi State Director for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which we called SNCC for short. And in its organizing in Mississippi, profound emphasis was placed on the involvement of women, everywhere and at all levels. We had, for example, a congressional challenge in 1965 where we challenged the seating of the regular all-white delegation to the House of Representatives, and there was instead an alternative election. And of the 5 congressional districts in Mississippi, 3 of the candidates were women. Now, in 1965, I don't think you could find that anywhere else in the United States of America, that kind of openness and attitudinal innovation with regard to the participation of women. So within the civil rights movement, women, whether they were local or volunteers or on staff, were all learning extraordinarily how to organize, how to mobilize, how to go door to door, how to organize precinct meetings, how to organize cooperatives, credit unions, etc. And this was really a first opportunity for the women who were participating. There was no women's flank in the civil rights movement. There was no adjunct. There was no separate wing. Women were first and foremost in the organizing, particularly by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So I think it's important for me to lay out the milieu of this, because what you have is an incredible ferment in the Mississippi program. And bear in mind that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had more full-time field secretaries than any of the other older organizations. It had only come into being in 1960 from the student sit-in leaders. But they were all influenced by Miss Baker's perception of leadership and the fact that it could be found anywhere. And you found women growing extraordinarily in stature and experience. Now, in that milieu, I too was thinking about the long-term effects on my own life, because I had learned so much from the people with whom I was working, but the local people who were some of the greatest teachers of my life, and people of extraordinary beneficence and kindness and magnanimity. But I was also seeing that the tools that we were using in Mississippi might be applied to the status of women. So it wasn't anything in the movement that was protestational so much as it was the learning that was taking place, a kind of culture of acceptance, readiness, and encouragement to women to reach their full fulfillment and to participate totally in what was happening inside the movement. Casey and I used to have exhaustive conversations with local women. We lived we lived outside the gates of the Tougaloo College, which had been which was a safe place for us to be. We would talk with the local women, other staff women, volunteers who were coming. We were always in ferment about what are the lessons of the movement that can be applied to the situation for women, because we believed that the relationships between men and women are among the deepest human potential and dilemmas of the human experience. I think it would be a mistake to see what Casey and I wrote as something that was protestational. It was really a manifestation of our own applied learnings from the work that we were doing in Mississippi with local people who were able to earn 25 cents or 30 cents an hour as sharecroppers in Mississippi. If they worked a 6-day week, they might take home $18. So we are talking about some of the most severely deprived people in the United States, and people who had historically been abused more than any other people who have come to the shores of the United States. And yet we were learning from them. And the document is more a manifestation of that, applying the insights from our organizing in communities that were so rich in their kind-heartedness. We had come to help, and yet in my view, I was gaining far more than I was able to give. And I think that the document really is a manifestation of that, in which we now felt free to raise deeper questions about the human condition, the relations between men and women, questions of fulfillment for women. And we wanted to surface a dialogue. That's what we wanted, a conversation. And so we sent the document to 40 women across the United States who were working in the peace and freedom movements. And note that I call it freedom movement, because that is actually the term that we used internally in those days. We thought freedom movement was more exemplary of what it was that we were seeking to effect. Even now, I think the term civil rights movement sort of conveys lawyers going into courtrooms more than it does people with nothing other than themselves and their own intelligence and their own wits and their own sensitivities joining together and working with self-reliance, no equipment, no materials, but joining together and organizing for the vote or for the creation of alternative or parallel institutions.
Brilliant. During our summer institute, one of our participants said that her goal in attending the institute was to help catalyze a global, transnational, radical feminist revolution. And we were really excited that we brought together an exciting group of people who we feel actually might be able to start putting things in order to create a truly transnational feminist radical solidarity network. In your mind, what are the key things that a true transnational feminist network would need today to be established? And what are the 2 or 3 key challenges to that?
Well, there's not going to be anything easy about this, but I would say to anyone who is listening that they should not be afraid, because women historically, when they have organized, have not been seeking to replace men. They have been seeking a broader democracy in which all people could be influential and in which there were policies that could be created that are responsive to all of the participants in the society. So I don't think you would see any of the kind of subliminal threats that you can see from some other movements. I don't think that that's going to be the case at all. I think that women are profoundly effective advocates for those who are in want, in need, suffering, who have conditions that have been unaddressed. They show themselves to be particularly effective in crossing divides, historic divisions. We've seen that in Srebrenica, we've seen it in Liberia, we've seen it among Israeli and Palestinian women. I certainly saw it in bushels in the civil rights movement, where there were a small but effective number of white Southern people who came into the movement and gave everything to the achieving of the goals of the movement. I think you would find a very holistic approach in which there would be comprehensive analysis of needs rather than narrow doctrinal approaches. Mm-hmm. This is not very comfortable for women. Women tend to have been very close to the ground. They are concerned with families. They have been excluded from military training. This is an asset, in my opinion. They understand social power. Mm-hmm. That is the power of a society that is not under the control of the military, but in the control of the people, should they come together and organize. Women also function very effectively in networking. And in fact, they are among the greatest networkers on the face of the planet right now. They worked naturally in networking. I've observed, and there's a certain amount of data for this, that women tend to use elliptical, cooperative patterns of organizing rather than top-down, mm-hmm. pyramidal organizing. I think that that would be manifested in this revolution. I also think that there will be limited goals articulated because of the practicality. In general, women have been very practical in the movements in which they have participated. The historian Carlton Mabey, for example, says that the first use of freedom rides and sit-ins in U.S. history to fight for justice was the women who were working in the abolitionist movement. But women tend to be very concrete in the way that they set a target and move toward it. And I think you would see that as well. So the political docket would be limited and achievable, which is something that Gandhi always emphasized. Mm-hmm. He said, you want achievable goals. Mm-hmm. And you want to stay away from vague goals like independence. He thought it was not a good idea to have a campaign for independence. Mm-hmm. And so that's why he chose the salt tax. Mm-hmm. It was a very precise tax imposed by the British in which the Indian people were being taxed for the salt in their natural resources of their oceans. Very, very pinpointed. I think you would see that kind of thinking where you go for concrete, demonstrable changes and not a lot of conversation about glowing abstractions. Mm. Those are some of my thoughts. The impediments are many. There are many who would be afraid. We live in an era in which so much happens through electronic means of communication. which is very susceptible to interruption. It's also something in which women do not now excel, although that can change rapidly. There are groups that are working on sharing the digital technologies, and in parts of the world where women have been brought into that, such as India, the results are stupendous. Indian farmers check the world prices for their agricultural goods every day online. And the kiosks all over India are maintained by women on a 24-hour basis. And they are stunningly effective. The United Nations Development Program has had some influence on that. So where we see that women are in fact put in charge of maintaining digital access, they do a fabulous job of administering it fairly for the good of everyone rather than unfairly. It's also in India that you have local governance in which it's required that at least 1/3 of the representatives who are elected be women. And there are social scientists in India who've been watching this for a long time. You have to bear in mind that the historic circumstances of patriarchy in India go back for millennia and are often very extreme. And there has been a history of cruelty toward women, which was one of the things that Gandhi lifelong worked against. And yet in India, we are seeing real breakthroughs, such as a requirement, if you're going to have local governments, you are required to have in the local councils, the Panchayat Raj they're called, Panchayat meaning 5 because that was the traditional number of elders in an Indian village, Raj meaning rule. So these are local councils, very micro, and with 1/3 women, it's a very large number of women who have now become trained and prepared and are facing and adjudicating all sorts of problems. So women will start out in this transformation that you and your colleagues are hypothesizing, unable to compete, but they will slowly be able to gain good competency, and they will be fair in the way they adjudicate it. They will not use it for the exclusion of others. There's no evidence of that. They will be using it for the assistance of people, human beings, men and women, all over the world. But it's not going to be easy because of the historic gaps and deficiencies. Even now we have a situation where education of girls is still at crisis levels in societies all over the world. And this is a great irony because institutions like the World Bank have known for decades that one of the most effective things that you could do is to put every girl in the world into school. It has yet to happen. So I hope this is part of the limited political docket of this mission.
Excellent. Great. Well, thank you so much, Mary, for offering a few of your thoughts to our group, and we appreciate all the work that you've done in this area over the course of your lifetime.
Thank you, Erica.